Okay, in this video, or the one that follows if we need to, we're going to talk about proformas, property level proformas, cash flow proformas. All of these are going to be tools that are frequently used in real estate investment to determine the value of a property. So we're going to just talk through each of these pieces, and let's start with a description of a proforma. So it's, as I mentioned, the centerpiece of discounted cash flow analysis or valuation. It's a fundamental tool in real estate investment analysis. And what we're doing is trying to forecast property level cash flows. And there's four basic components here. We're going to look at the operating cash flows, that is to say the revenues and expenses of the property. We're going to look at the capital cash flows, so that would be capital expenditures, then TIs, tenant improvements, and leasing commissions. We're going to look at reversion cash flows. That's another way of saying the sale of the property or the disposition of the property. And then lastly, we would layer on the financing cash flows. So that would be any loans that are involved, if there's mezzanine financing, other sources of capital that help purchase the property. We would look at the cash flows attributable to each of those things as well. So, to get to the operating cash flows and ultimately get to the net operating income, that's the NOI, we need to start with the leases and all of the available spaces. So the first line item, the starting point for everything is going to be the potential gross income. So in order to get the potential gross income, we're going to take the rent per square foot and multiply that times all the rentable square feet in the building. Frequently, with leases in place, we'll just take a look at the leases in place, multiply the rent per square foot times the leased square feet, and then for the vacant space, we'll take the number of rentable square feet in that vacant space, and then multiply it times the appropriate rent, the market rent for that space. So that gives us the potential gross income. All of the space is rented. It's assuming basically 100% occupancy. It's the potential, what the building could do. But of course, most buildings are not doing that. They're not 100% occupied all year long. So we're going to deduct a vacancy allowance, and the result will be this term called the effective gross income. So in order to determine the vacancy allowance, we're going to take the vacancy rate or an assumed vacancy rate. Frequently, that'll be based on the market conditions or our past experience, or maybe just a set assumption of 5%, something like that. We're going to multiply that times the potential gross income. So if we had a 5% vacancy allowance and the potential gross income was $100,000, we would just deduct $5,000 as the vacancy allowance. And the result, $95,000, that would be our effective gross income. So we march down and we would add any other sources of revenue. So things like storage, lockers, rental storage units. If there are rooftop towers that are cell phone types of things, we might be getting income from having a tall building with some towers that we've rented out. There could be a laundry room in a multifamily facility. We might have parking income from a parking garage, and it could be all sorts of other things as well. Anything that's not from leased space in a building, but otherwise it's income to the property owners, that would be termed other income. And so from these sources of revenue, this net revenue that we have, effective gross income plus other income would be kind of our total revenues. We're going to subtract out all of the operating expenses for the property. And these could be broken in one simple way into fixed and variable expenses. The fixed expenses are those that do not change based on the occupancy of the property. Things like property taxes and insurance are frequently going to be fixed. You're going to have to pay those no matter if you have any tenants or not. Whereas variable expenses are going to be a function of how full the building is, how occupied it is. So for instance, with utilities, we may be paying much less in utilities if the building is empty. We don't need to air condition it as much or cool it as much cool it in the summer, air condition it in the summer, or heat it in the winter. We may not have as much maintenance. We may not take care of the grounds as much. But if we have tenants in there, we're going to have to keep it at a habitable temperature. We're going to make it look pretty. We're going to clean the office building, etc. And then management fee is another variable expense that's going to vary based on how much income is coming to the property. Typically, the management fee is going to be some percentage of the gross revenue from the property. So all of these expenses we're going to subtract out, and once we've taken those out, we're going to have this thing called net operating income, and that's a fundamental metric for a real estate property. Let's move on to the next slide here and take a look at what we've done so far. We got the potential gross income. We're going to subtract out the vacancy allowance, add in other income, take out all the operating expenses, and the result is this thing called net operating income. A little asterisk here. Later on, we're going to add another source of cash flows coming in, and that would be the expense recoveries. We've touched on those in other discussions where we might have triple net leases or modified gross or even base year stop leases. There could be income coming from our tenants in order to help pay for the expenses that they are incurring in the property. Well, let's move on to the next category and look at capital expenditures. These are frequently talked about as being below the line, and the line is this line right here that's under operating expenses and above net operating income. Our bottom line, so to speak, is the net operating income. So anything below that line is going to be termed a capital expenditure that is below the line. The line is net operating income, our bottom line, so to speak. And it's strange now that I say that, the bottom line, there's things even below that, but regardless, we got capital expenditures, and those could be a few different things. We might have property improvements, things like repairs. So if our HVAC system needs some work, if we're going to replace the roof, if we're going to resurface the parking lot, if there are other things that need to be taken care of, these would be capital expenditures that don't kind of get cooked into the net operating income. They're not operating expenses, they're capital expenses. So we would look at those perhaps as being things we need to pay for immediately, or we might be budgeting for the future. Then there are leasing costs. These are capital expenditures that are directly tied to leasing efforts, and these are going to be things like a leasing commission or a tenant improvement. So a leasing commission is going to be a percent of the lease value. So if you sign a new lease with a tenant, you're going to pay some percentage of the value of that entire lease typically. So if it's a 5-year lease, we're going to look at what rental payments are going to be happening over the entire 5-year life of the lease, and then the leasing commission will be some percentage of that total number. Tenant improvements are monies that we need to spend to get the space habitable, usable for a particular tenant. It might be things like putting in interior walls to configure the space in such a way that it's works well for the tenant. There might be new carpet, new paint, new light fixtures, etc. So those are the capital expenditures. Let's move on to how this kind of fits in with things. We've got through the NOI. We would subtract out the capital expenditures, so below the line, below the bottom line of net operating income, and we get this thing called property cash flow. Well, let's move on to some other things here. This is one of the most important cash flows when you're looking at a pro forma, and that is the reversion or the disposition cash flow. That's basically just fancy ways of saying you're selling the building. And so this is when we go to sell the property, we're going to look at what the condition of the property is. Is it in good shape? What's the type and the quality of the property? These are all important characteristics and considerations. And we're going to use a market cap rate. So again, cap rate is defined as the net operating income of the building divided by the value. So we can use that cap rate, and frequently we'll talk about an exit cap or a reversion cap, sometimes called a terminal cap rate. Terminal just meaning the end, at the end. We can have a resale cap rate or a going out cap rate. All of these are communicating the same thing. So for instance, if we have a building and we're selling it at a 5 cap and it's got $20,000 of NOI, we would divide $20,000 by 0.05 and we would get a value of $400,000. You can double check that math. And with that sale, we're going to need to take out any expenses associated with the selling. So things like legal expenses, there may be some fees we have to pay, some taxes. We may need to pay marketing costs, things to print brochures and advertise our building. And then frequently there's going to be selling commissions. We're paying a broker to help us dispose of the building, to sell the building. I'm going to go ahead and stop here for this first video, and we'll pick up with the next slide and look at how this is going so far. We'll march through this income statement and move on to the rest of the video or the rest of the slides in the next video. So I'll see you then.